My name is Bill Byrne, and this is my son Patrick, and we would like to tell you the true story of our four-generation Ford legacy. I'll narrate the story, and Patrick will illustrate with photos and some of his Ford race videos. In our first Ford generation, it all began with my grandfather's two brothers, who started an aluminum die casting foundry in the 1930s in Cleveland, Ohio. By the 1950s and for 30 years thereafter, 80% of their production was dedicated to supplying Ford with aluminum transmission housings, transmission tail casings, and other aluminum parts. As a preferred parts supplier to Ford, they qualified for fleet pricing discounts, and as such, they always drove new Fords and Lincolns. Their wives, my aunts, bought a brand new Thunderbird every other year. In our second Ford generation, there was my father, who built one of the first Dairy Queens in Ohio in 1946. In those days, franchise owners qualified for fleet discounts, and so he convinced Dairy Queen Corporation to make Ford their fleet car brand. And of course, we then as a family bought and drove Fords. The first car I remember was our black 1954 Ford Coupe. My father ordered it with the police package and overdrive. It was a manual transmission, 3 on the tree, of course. Our second family car was a 57 two-tone red cream convertible with a black rag top. Beautiful car. We drove that car all over Ohio. It was just like a real-life 1950s TV commercial. My mother and sister had scarves on for the wind, and my dad and I were laughing through every gear change. In our third generation of Fords, I came on the scene. In the early 60s, the largest indoor shopping mall was built in Cleveland Heights called Severance Center. The mall decided to have a luxury and sports car show indoors, which was the first show of its kind in the U.S. All the sports car and luxury dealers were represented, but it was a last-minute entry that was the showstopper. Carroll Shelby was on his way back from a Detroit presentation when his transporter broke down and had to stop in Cleveland for repairs. He showed up at the show with a 289 Cobra and a prototype of the GT40. As a young kid, I was amazed. I rushed home and grabbed my dad and went back up to the show where we chatted with Carroll and his crew chief. We were blown away. Right then and there, I looked at my dad and I said, I don't know when, but someday I'm going to own one of these cars. When I graduated from college, I jumped in my red 1967 Ford pickup and drove to Denver. It was a 289 with 80,000 miles on it, but it ran like a top. During the next 15 years, we started our own family and ended up buying a Ford minivan, 4 Ford Explorers, and 4 Ford pickups. About that time, I got a call from a banker friend who had just been handed the titles and keys to a vintage car collection that belonged to an investor who had gotten into arrears with his debt. I was asked to help appraise the cars and get them into running order. In the collection of about 19 cars were 2 original Ford GT40s. One was a spare Le Mans car that never saw the race, and the other was a test mule. I was lucky enough to be in charge of getting both cars running, which involved several track tests. I was getting close to ownership, but still had a young family, and the timing wasn't quite right. Our fourth Ford generation starts with my son, Patrick, riding dirt bikes. As time passed, his mother grew ever more concerned, so I threw out a bribe where I promised that if he would sell his motorcycles, I would let him race cars. So where do you think we ended up? Yep, racing Fords. Spec racer Fords to be exact, the most competitive class in SCCA. And we are happy to say that Patrick just won the 2015 SCCA Oregon and Pacific Northwest Regional Championships in his number 02 red Generation 3 Ford. But of course that wasn't enough. We decided to buy and race 2 vintage Formula Fords, a 1970 Lotus 69 and a 1971 Titan Mark 6C, both with Ford racing motors. These are considered to be the two best Formula Fords of that golden 60s and 70s era. And what do we tow all these race cars with? Yeah, you guessed it, our 2011 Ford F-250 Super Duty with a 6.7-liter diesel. And did we mention our Ford Ranch truck? Yeah, it's a 2006 F-250 that we use for absolutely everything, from snow plowing to hauling wood, etc., etc. I guess this is where we should say that in 2005, we bought the first Ford GT in Eastern Washington. A gentleman by the name of Walt Worthy bought the first one. His was black, ours was white with the blue stripe. Our first Ford GT was the base model with the standard wheels, etc. So the next year we bought a silver GT40 with the rally wheels, the Macintosh stereo, and all the options. I don't have to tell you about the driving experience. We took them to shows, we drove them on the track, we drove them in the country. Basically, we reveled in the fact that we had finally reached one of our great goals. We could mention other endless facts about our Ford connections. For example, as soon as Shelby approved Superformance building Cobras, we ordered a custom black one with a Ford aluminum racing motor. Or how we are friends with Shelby racing legend Alan Grant, who drove for Carroll in the famous yellow Coventry Motors Cobra, the Exterminator. Both my son and I have actually driven that car on the track. But suffice to say, we have one more empty spot in our garage, and Ford is building the car to fill that spot. The GT, the new GT. Are we deserving? Well, I guess we will have to leave that up to you, but we think we've earned it through our 4 generations of Ford loyalty. Thanks for listening.